What if your next burger didn't come from a cow raised on a sprawling Midwestern farm but from a lab, grown cell by cell in a stainless steel bioreactor? Imagine a world where meat is no longer harvested from animals, but cultivated in labs, eliminating slaughterhouses, reducing greenhouse gases, and potentially transforming the entire American farming industry as we know it. Sounds like science fiction. It's not. This is the reality being engineered in high-tech labs around the globe, and it's shaking the very foundations of one of the oldest and most iconic pillars of American identity: traditional livestock farming. The idea of lab-grown meat, also known as cultured or cell-based meat, is not just a radical innovation. It's a direct challenge to a system that has existed for thousands of years. In the American context, farming is more than an industry. It's a cultural symbol, woven into the very fabric of national mythology, from the cowboy on the open range to the family-run dairy farms of Wisconsin. For generations, the image of cattle grazing on open plains has represented not only sustenance, but also self-reliance, grit, and heritage. But the rise of lab-grown meat could signal a seismic shift away from this legacy. Driven by science, sustainability, and shifting consumer ethics, to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the first successful lab-grown hamburger. Unveiled in London in 2013, it took Dutch scientist Mark Post and his team at Maastricht University 2 years and over $300,000 in funding to produce that single patty. The goal: to prove that meat could be grown without animals, using a process called cellular agriculture. They extracted muscle stem cells from a cow, fed them nutrients, and encouraged them to multiply into muscle tissue, essentially growing meat without ever slaughtering an animal. At the time, it was a scientific marvel. Today, it's the blueprint for a new kind of food economy. Fast forward to today, and companies like Upside Foods, Good Meat, Moza Meat, and Believer Meats are racing to bring lab-grown chicken, beef, and pork to grocery shelves and restaurant menus. In 2023, the U.S. Department of Agriculture gave its first-ever approval for the sale of cultivated meat, allowing 2 companies to serve cultured chicken to consumers. That same year, Singapore became the first country in the world to allow commercial PHS, the allowed commercial sale of lab-grown meat. Meanwhile, billions in venture capital are flooding into the space, signaling that this isn't just a fringe idea. It's a rapidly accelerating industry with serious global implications. But let's zoom in on what this means for the American farmer. For centuries, the U.S. agricultural system has been rooted in animal husbandry, raising cattle, pigs, and chickens for food. Livestock production accounts for a significant portion of rural jobs, land use, and economic activity. The beef industry alone contributes over $70 billion annually to the U.S. economy and supports hundreds of thousands of workers, from ranchers to feedlot operators. If lab-grown meat gains mainstream acceptance, it could dramatically reduce the need for traditional animal farming. That means less demand for grazing land, feed crops like corn and soy, and the infrastructure that supports livestock, transportation, and processing. In other words, an entire ecosystem, economic, ecological, and cultural, could be upended. And it's not just about economics. This shift raises deep emotional and identity questions. What happens to the multi-generational cattle rancher whose livelihood is suddenly obsolete? Will rural communities that rely on livestock farming collapse, or will they adapt to new roles in this emerging food chain? Can lab-grown meat ever truly replace the flavor, texture, and satisfaction of traditional meat? These aren't easy questions, and they go far beyond taste or convenience. They touch on the very soul of how we produce and consume food. Yet the driving forces behind the cultured meat revolution are compelling. The environmental benefits alone are staggering. Traditional animal agriculture is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, and water pollution worldwide. According to a 2021 study published in Nature Food, lab-grown meat could reduce land use by over 90% and water consumption by more than 75% compared to conventional meat. Methane emissions from cattle, one of the most potent greenhouse gases, could be virtually eliminated. If scaled effectively, cultured meat offers a way to meet global protein demands without pushing our planet past its ecological limits. But technological innovation doesn't occur in a vacuum. It faces resistance, skepticism, and regulatory hurdles. Some critics argue that lab-grown meat is just another corporate-driven attempt to control the food system. Others question the safety, nutrition, and ethical implications of growing cells in bioreactors, and many people simply find the idea of eating lab meat unappetizing or unnatural, even if it's biologically identical to the real thing. Overcoming these psychological and cultural barriers may prove just as difficult as scaling the science itself. Despite these cultural hurdles, the tide of public opinion is slowly shifting. Younger generations, particularly millennials and Gen Z, are increasingly open to food innovations that promise ethical and environmental benefits. According to a 2022 survey by Pew Research, over 60% of Americans aged 18 to 29 said they would be willing to try lab-grown meat, compared to less than 30% of those over 60. This generational divide reflects a deeper view. Evolution and how people perceive food not just as fuel, but as an extension of their values. Animal welfare, climate change, and sustainability are no longer fringe concerns. For many, they are central to the purchasing decision, and lab-grown meat fits neatly into that moral framework. From a technological standpoint, progress has been rapid, but significant challenges remain. One of the biggest barriers is cost. While the first lab-grown burger cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce, costs have plummeted since then. By 2021, some startups claimed they could produce a cultured chicken nugget for under $10. Still, this remains more expensive than conventional meat, especially when considering the economies of scale industrial farms have built over decades. Bioreactors, the massive steel tanks used to grow the cells, require complex machinery, precise conditions, and a sterile environment. Scaling this up to serve millions of consumers is not just a science problem, it's an engineering and logistical one. Another challenge is the growth medium, the nutrient-rich liquid used to feed the animal cells as they multiply. Historically, many labs have used fetal bovine serum, an ingredient derived from cow fetuses, which presents ethical and cost issues. Recent breakthroughs, however, have enabled scientists to develop plant-based and synthetic alternatives. In 2023, several companies reported successful trials using animal-free media, a critical step toward making the process truly cruelty-free and commercially viable. These innovations are essential if lab-grown meat is to become a true alternative to traditional meat. Rather than a high-end novelty, let's not forget the regulatory landscape, which will play a decisive role in how quickly lab-grown meat can enter the mainstream. In the United States, the regulatory framework is shared between the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA. In 2022, both agencies released a joint agreement outlining how cultured meat products would be overseen, from pre-market safety assessments to labeling. This dual-agency model is intended to maintain rigorous safety standards while providing a clear pathway to market. However, as with all new technologies, regulation lags behind innovation. Every step forward must navigate a maze of approvals, public comment periods, and policy debates. Meanwhile, the traditional meat industry isn't sitting idle. Major meat packers like Tyson Foods and Cargill have begun investing in lab-grown startups, signaling a strategic pivot rather than outright opposition. These companies recognize that the future of meat may not lie entirely in fields and feedlots, but also in fermentation tanks and clean rooms. By partnering with or acquiring cultured meat companies, they're hedging their bets and ensuring a stake in whatever shape the future of protein takes. This blend of old and new is creating strange bedfellows legacy meat giants, collaborating with biotech innovators to redefine the dinner plate. Still, tension simmers beneath the surface. Some farm advocacy groups and rural politicians have pushed back hard against the rise of lab-grown alternatives. Bills have been introduced in several U.S. states to ban the use of the word meat for anything not derived from a slaughtered animal. The concern is not just semantic, it's economic. If lab-grown meat is allowed to compete on an equal marketing footing, it could erode consumer trust in conventional meat and potentially undercut prices. For traditional farmers, this isn't just a product war, it's a battle for identity and survival. Yet there's also an argument to be made that cultured meat doesn't have to spell the end of American farming. It could signal its rebirth. Just as the mechanization of agriculture in the 20th century forced farms to adapt or disappear, the rise of cellular agriculture could inspire a new generation of biofarmers, technicians, and food scientists. Imagine rural towns retooled with bioreactor facilities instead of feedlots, offering skilled jobs in food, tech, and biotech rather than backbreaking labor. This isn't just about preserving old ways. It's about envisioning new futures. And let's be clear, this is not about replacing all traditional farming overnight. The transition, if it happens, will be gradual and uneven. Certain types of meat may be easier to replicate in labs than others. Ground meats like burgers and nuggets are already achievable, but complex structures like steaks or ribs where muscle, fat, and connective tissue need to be arranged just right are far more difficult to engineer. Even the most advanced companies admit it will take years before lab-grown meat can match the price, texture, and flavor of every traditional cut. In the meantime, hybrid products mixing cultured cells with plant-based ingredients may serve as a bridge between the two worlds. But even as hybrid products begin to emerge and the science races ahead, there's a deeper societal question lurking in the background, one that goes beyond biology, economics, or environmental metrics. What happens when a process as ancient and natural as raising animals for food is replaced by a sterile, engineered alternative? For many, food is not just sustenance. It's memory, identity, even ritual. A 4th of July barbecue with friends, Thanksgiving turkey carved at the table, the smell of grilled steak in a backyard, these are experiences tied to tradition, not just ingredients. Can lab-grown meat, no matter how identical at the molecular level, truly recreate that emotional connection? There's also the issue of power and control. As the cultured meat industry grows, it's being led not by farmers, but by technologists, venture capitalists, and biotech corporations. This shift concentrates control of food production in a much smaller circle, raising concerns about monopolies, data privacy, and resilience. In traditional farming, millions of independent actors contribute to the food supply. In a future dominated by lab-grown meat, a few companies could control massive swaths of what we eat, how it's made, and what it costs. Critics argue this could leave us vulnerable to centralized failures, cyber attacks, or corporate manipulation of food systems. Supporters counter that with proper regulation. The benefits outweigh the risks. Interestingly, the push for lab-grown meat has also sparked renewed interest in food transparency. People want to know what they're eating, where it comes from, and how it's made. Companies in this space have responded by opening their doors literally. Upside Foods, for example, designed its pilot plant in California with glass walls and public viewing areas to demystify the process. Other startups have embraced clear labeling and education campaigns, trying to reframe the conversation not around frankenfood fears, but around precision, cleanliness, and sustainability. It's a rebranding of meat itself, not just as something grown, but something crafted. There are early signs that this strategy may be working. In blind taste tests, some consumers can't tell the difference between lab-grown and conventional meat. In fact, in a 2023 consumer study conducted by the Good Food Institute, over 80% of participants who tried cultured chicken said they would buy it again. For urban populations, especially those who have little to no connection with rural, farming lab-grown meat may be seen not as a betrayal of tradition, but as a technological marvel that aligns with modern values. It's not a rejection of the past, but an upgrade for the future. Globally, the implications are equally profound. In countries with limited arable land or water, lab-grown meat could provide food security without the ecological cost. In developing regions where demand for protein is rising rapidly, it could offer a sustainable path to nourishment without replicating the environmental mistakes of industrial agriculture. If widely adopted, it could reduce deforestation in the Amazon, protect biodiversity, and ease pressure on oceans overfished for protein. It's not just an American issue. It's a planetary one. So, is lab-grown meat the end of the American farming era that depends on how we define farming? If farming means tending to the land, caring for animals, and working under open skies, then yes, this could be the beginning of a major decline. But if farming is about feeding people, innovating in the face of scarcity and adapting to the demands of a changing world, then maybe lab-grown meat is just farming by a new name. Perhaps the American farmer of tomorrow wears a lab coat instead of boots, and instead of herding cattle, they manage cell cultures. The question isn't whether lab-grown meat will replace traditional meat, it's how much of the market it will take, and how society will respond to that shift. Will we mourn the loss of the old ways, or embrace the possibilities of the new? Will rural communities be left behind, or will they evolve and find new relevance? As with every major technological revolution, the outcome will depend not just on what's possible, but on the choices we make individually and collectively as we shape the future of food. So the next time you bite into a burger, ask yourself, not just what is this made of, but how was it made and why does it matter? Because the answer might just determine the future of farming, the fate of the environment, and the legacy we leave behind on every plate we serve.